How old is feminism?
Feminists, people who believe that women should have economic, political, and social equality with men, have existed throughout history. Such women are often described in literature and by history as being women before their time. But as a movement, feminism, which is synonymous with the women's rights movement, did not get underway until the mid-1800s. When women in the United States and Great Britain began organizing and campaigning to win the vote. Early feminists, and feminists today, were likely influenced by the revolutionary work titled A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in 1792 by British author and educator Mary Wollstonecraft. 1759 to 1797, her daughter was writer Mary Shelley of Frankenstein fame. Wollstonecraft attacked the convention of the day, charging that it kept middle-class and upper-class women in a state of ignorance, training them to be useless. A staunch promoter of education, she was self-educated. Wollstonecraft is credited with being the first major philosophical feminist.
Who was Confucius and who do people still quote him?
Confucius, 551 to 479 B.C., was a Chinese philosopher whose real name was Keung Chiu. Confucius is the Latinized version. Born into a class of lesser nobility in the province of Lu. His father died before Confucius had turned 3 and he was raised in humble circumstances by his mother. He lived in the middle of China's feudal period, when there were enormous problems, including famine and poverty, which had been brought on by weak emperors and, consequently, chronic warfare among rival feudal states. Because of his upbringing, Confucius possessed a profound sympathy for the common people. In his view, the feudal princes, only interested in their own personal gain, were responsible for the suffering of the people. Confucius set out on a reform mission, believing that good government can only be achieved by ethical leaders. Confucius endeavored to train a new generation of them. He taught literature and music, important in building character, conduct, and, most importantly, ethics, to anyone who wanted to learn. He is regarded as the first Chinese teacher to offer education freely. That is to say, to all comers, rather than just the privileged. The great philosopher is revered for his belief that the family is the model for all human relations. Confucianism regards the chief relations in life to be those between ruler and subject, father and son, elder and younger brother, husband and wife, and friends. Most importantly, he taught students that rulers are responsible for the happiness of their subjects. He believed that government leaders need not be expert administrators. Instead, they must be humane, honest, and above corruption and personal gain. Some of his students went on to hold positions of power in city governments. Over the centuries, he became the most venerated person in Chinese history. But his teachings transcend cultural lines, which is why Confucian wisdom, including the principle what you do not want done to yourself, do not do to others, is often quoted. The philosophy's maxims are set forth in the work Lunyu, Analects, recorded by his followers. Except for his time spent in military service, Socrates lived his entire life in Athens, where he was as well known for his disheveled appearance as for his moral integrity, self-control, and quest for wisdom. He lived during a time when attention was turning away from the physical world of the heavens, and toward the human world, of the self, the community, and the law. He participated in this turning point by walking the streets of Athens, engaging people including rulers who were supposed to be wiser than he in conversation. In these conversations, he employed what came to be known as the Socratic method or dialectic, a series of seemingly simple questions designed to elicit a rational response. Through the line of questioning, which usually centered around a moral concept such as courage, the person being questioned was intended to realize that he did not truly know that which he thought he knew. Socrates' theory was that once the person being questioned realized his weak understanding, he could divest himself of false notions, and was then free to participate in the quest for knowledge. These philosophical disputes, however, gained Socrates many enemies. Though he left no writings, Socrates' student, Plato, documented his recollections of dialogues with his teacher. A staunch believer in self-examination and self-knowledge, Socrates is credited with saying that the unexamined life is not worth living. Some ascribe the quote to Plato. Socrates also believed that the psyche, or inner self, is what should give direction to one's life, not appetite or passions. A seminal figure in Greek, and Western, thought, philosophy that predates him is termed pre-Socratic.
How long have people been getting sick?
Humankind has suffered from illnesses since humans first appeared on Earth millions of years ago. But in the absence of medical knowledge, which only began about 5,000 years ago, ailments and sickness were assumed to have been brought on by angered gods or evil spirits. Even today, some primitive groups believe they must appease the gods and spirits through offerings and sacrifices in order to stave off or rid themselves of illness. These are practices carried out by witch doctors or healers. In prehistoric times, such superstitious beliefs resulted in the first medical procedure, in which a hole was drilled into the patient's skull. This practice was believed to allow evil spirits to escape the body and thereby rid the body of sickness. Fossil findings showing this method of treatment date back about 10,000 years. One vestige of ancient treatments of illness that still has relevance today is the use of plants and plant substances for medicinal purposes.
What caused the Bosnian War?
To understand the war in Bosnia, 1992–95, it is important to review the history of Yugoslavia. Treaties at the end of World War I, 1914–18, dissolved the Austria-Hungarian Empire, creating separate nations of Austria and Hungary and dividing their former territory into three new countries: Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. The various factions within the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes struggled for power. In 1929, King Alexander I, 1888–1934, an ethnic Serbian, dismissed the national parliament, did away with the constitution, 1921, and declared an absolute monarchy. He also changed the country's name to Yugoslavia. The government was then dominated by ethnic Serbs, who had settled in the region as early as the 7th century AD and were converted to Eastern Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, by the 9th century. But the Serbian authority was challenged by the nation's ethnic Croats, whose ancestors had settled in the region by the 7th century AD and were converted to Western Christianity, Roman Catholicism, by the Franks. To try to end the struggle, in 1939 Croats were given limited autonomy within Yugoslavia. The arrangement was short-lived. Yugoslavia was invaded by the Axis powers in April 1941 in World War II, 1939–45. The war over, in 1946 Yugoslavia was divided into 6 federated republics: Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Slovenia. But the lines of demarcation between these republics paid little regard to the ethnic boundaries of Serbs, Croats, and Muslims, who have been in the region since 1526, when it was invaded by Turks. Federal power was in the hands of communist leader Josip Broz Tito, 1892–1980. At first Tito tied his government to the Soviet Union. He directed the nationalization of land, industry, utilities, and natural resources. But after 1948 he pursued a policy of non-alignment. In the 1980s Yugoslavia's economy weakened, exacerbating regional differences. Tensions among ethnic groups flared. In 1991, as communism fell across Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia began to break apart. By March 1992 4 of its republics had declared independence: Croatia, Slovenia, Macedonia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. What remained of Yugoslavia were Serbia and Montenegro. Serbs living in Bosnia and Herzegovina objected to the Declaration of Independence, which had been approved by the republic's Croats and Muslims. Fighting broke out in Bosnia, centered around the capital city of Sarajevo. Troops from Serbia entered the region to back the ethnic uprising in Bosnia. As with many civil wars, the conflict divided families and friends. Evidence mounted that the Serbs, under the direction of leader Radovan Karadzic, 1945, were engaged in a program of ethnic cleansing, including the mass murder of tens of thousands of Muslim refugees. In May 1995, after the Serbian military in Bosnia refused to comply with the United Nations, UN, ultimatum, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, began a campaign of strategic airstrikes on Serbian targets. The NATO assaults weakened the Serbs and brought them to the negotiating table in November 1995, when U.S. mediators helped broker a peace agreement in Dayton, Ohio. A single state, Bosnia and Herzegovina, was re-established. It was to be governed through a power-sharing arrangement among Serbs, Croats, and Muslims. But the conflict in Yugoslavia was not over. By 1998 the region's ethnic disputes erupted into another civil war, this time in the Kosovo province. In 2003 Yugoslavia was effectively dissolved with the establishment of the country of Serbia. And Montenegro through a peace accord brokered by officials from the European Union, EU. The new arrangement gave greater autonomy to each republic.
Were there hospitals before the Middle Ages?
Public hospitals emerged during the Middle Ages, 500–1350. As Christianity spread and religious orders set up the facilities to serve the poor. Still, most people received a doctor's care in the privacy of their own homes. The concept of a public health care facility originated in India as early as the 3rd century BC when Buddhists established hospital-like installations. The Middle Ages saw the establishment of facilities more closely resembling modern hospital, including Paris's Hôtel Dieu. Founded in the 7th century, today it is the oldest hospital still in operation. In 970 a hospital in Baghdad, in present-day Iraq, divided physicians into the equivalent of modern-day interns and externs. Its pharmacy disseminated drugs, as well as spices deemed to have medicinal value, from all over the known world.
Why was Galileo tried for heresy by the Inquisition?
The trouble began for Galileo, 1564–1642, in 1613 when he published Letters on the Solar Spots, in which he advocated the Copernican system of the universe, which proposed that Earth, along with other galactic bodies, revolves around the Sun. This view ran contrary to the accepted beliefs of the Roman Catholic Church, whose doctrine was based on Ptolemy's theory that Earth was the center of the universe and that all the planets, including the Sun, revolved around it. Thus, in 1616 the Pope issued a decree declaring the Copernican system to be false and erroneous, and Galileo was ordered not to support it. When a new pope, Urban VIII, was coronated in 1624, Galileo traveled to Rome to make an appeal that the edict against the Copernican theory be revoked. The Pope declined to do so, but he did give Galileo permission to write about the Copernican system, under the condition that he not give it preference over the church-sanctioned Ptolemaic model. So, in 1632, Galileo published again, Dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. However, contained unconvincing objections to the Copernican view. The Church saw through it and summoned the author to Rome to stand before the Inquisition. Church interrogators. Galileo was accused of violating the original edict of 1616, put on trial for heresy, and found guilty. Though he was ordered to recant, at some point he uttered the famous statement, "And yet it moves," a reference to the Copernican theory that Earth rotates on its axis. Galileo was supposed to be imprisoned, but the Pope commuted the sentence to house arrest at Galileo's home near Florence, where he died blind at the age of 78.
When did Marco Polo travel to the Far East?
Marco Polo, 1254 to 1324, was only in his teens when he left Venice in about 1270 with his father, Niccolo, and his uncle Maffeo, traveling an overland route to the east. The Polo brothers had made such a trip once before. In 1260 they had traveled as far as Beijing, China. But upon their return home, they learned that Niccolo's wife, Marco Polo's mother, had died. So when the pair of adventurers set out again, they took the young Marco Polo with them. The Polos traveled from Acre, Israel, to Shavaz, Turkey, then through Mosul and Baghdad, in Iraq, to Ormuz, a bustling trade center on the Persian Gulf, where they intended to take a ship for the east. Seeing the ships, the travelers determined they weren't reliable transport, so they opted to continue on land. Heading north to Khorasan, in Iran, through Afghanistan, and to the Pamirs, a high plateau range in Central Asia. It took the Polos 40 days to traverse the high-altitude range, finally reaching the garden city of Kashgar, China. From there, the Polos followed a path skirting the Taklamakan Desert and then rested before crossing the Gobi Desert, which they did in 30 days' time, covering some 300 miles. Stopping in Tunhuang, the center of Buddhism in China, the European travelers then followed a southeast path that would have paralleled the Great Wall, constructed in the 3rd century BC. After following the Yellow, Huanghe, river, the Polos were met by emissaries of Kublai Khan, 1215 to 1294. They continued with their guides on a 40-day trip to Xanadu, Shangtu, China, 300 miles north of Beijing, where they were received by Kublai Khan himself, founder and ruler of the Mongol dynasty and grandson of Genghis Khan. c. 1162 to 1227. It was May 1275. Kublai Khan, who was an ardent Buddhist and a patron of the arts, took a liking to the young Marco Polo, who entered into diplomatic service for the ruler. In that capacity Marco Polo traveled to India and visited the kingdom of Kampa, what is now Vietnam, Thailand, the Malay Peninsula, Sumatra, Sri Lanka and India. The Polos, European courtiers who were well liked by the Great Khan, stayed in China until 1292, finally returning home by way of Sumatra, India and Persia, present-day Iran. In 1295 they arrived back in Venice, which they found at war with longtime rival Genoa. The Polos carried with them many riches, including ivory, jade, jewels, porcelain, and silk. Marco Polo was now a man in his 40s and had spent most of his life thus far in the Far East.
Did Michelangelo study anatomy?
Yes, in 1492 Michelangelo Buonarroti, 1475 to 1564, a master sculptor of the human form, undertook the study of anatomy based on the dissection of corpses from the hospital of Santo Spirito. Perhaps most well known for his sculptures of David, 1501-04, and Moses, 1515-15. As well as his frescoes on the ceiling and walls of the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo was also an architect who believed that buildings should follow the form of the human body to the extent of disposing units symmetrically around a central and unique axis, in a relationship like that of the arms to the body. He also wrote poetry. He was a true Renaissance man. Michelangelo was totally absorbed in his work and was known to be impatient with himself and with others. He has been likened to German composer Ludwig van Beethoven. 1770 to 1827, since the personal letters of both men reveal a deep sympathy and concern for those close to them, and profound understanding of humanity informs their works, Gardner's art through the ages.
What was the Atlantic Charter?
On the eve of direct U.S. involvement in World War II, 1939-45, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882-1945, met with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. 1874-1965, on board a ship off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada. There the two leaders drew up a program of peace objectives known as the Atlantic Charter, which they signed on August 14, 1941. In addition to other peacetime goals, the charter roughly contained Roosevelt's 4 freedoms, which he had outlined in his speech to Congress on January 6, 1941. As the legislative body considered passage of the Lend-Lease Act, Roosevelt believed that freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear should prevail around the world. Briefly, in the Atlantic Charter the two leaders stated that neither of their countries sought new territories, that they respected the right of the people of each country to choose their own form of government, that no country, great or small, victor or vanquished, would be deprived access to the raw materials it needed for its own economic prosperity. That countries should cooperate to improve labor standards and social security, that after the final destruction of the Nazi tyranny, all the men in all the lands may live out their lives in freedom from fear and want, and that a wider and permanent system of general security would be necessary to ensure peace. This last statement alludes to the future establishment of the United Nations.
What was the Enola Gay?
It was the American B-29 bomber that dropped the first atomic bomb ever used in warfare. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay flew over Hiroshima, Japan, to drop a bomb over the city. The explosion killed an estimated 80,000 people and leveled an area of about 5 square miles in Hiroshima, an important manufacturing and military center. Thousands more died later from radiation exposure.
When was the Red Cross founded?
The Red Cross was founded in Switzerland in October 1863 when the delegates from 16 nations met in Geneva to discuss establishing in all civilized countries permanent societies of volunteers who in time of war would give help to the wounded without regard for nationality. The idea had been described in a pamphlet published in 1862 by Swiss philanthropist Jean-Henri Dunant, 1828–1910. In 1859 Dunant was in Italy when French and Italian troops under Napoleon III fought Austrians under Emperor Francis Joseph in an indecisive battle in Lombardy, northern Italy. At Solferino, Dunant observed the suffering of the wounded and immediately organized a group of volunteers to help them. At the Geneva Conference in 1863, the delegates decided the organization symbol and name. The name of the organization comes from its flag showing a red cross on a white background, the inverse of the flag of Switzerland, where the organization was founded. The following August, 1864, European delegates met again. This time they were joined by 2 American observers. The meeting gave rise to the First Geneva Convention, which determined the protection of sick and wounded soldiers and of medical personnel and facilities during wartime. The Red Cross was adopted as a symbol for neutral aid. In Muslim countries the organization is known as the Red Crescent.
What were the Swedish colonial holdings?
The Swedish possessions consisted of a small colony called New Sweden, established in 1638 at Fort Christina, present-day Wilmington, Delaware. The Swedes gradually extended the settlement from the mouth of the Delaware Bay south of Wilmington, northward along the Delaware River as far as present-day Trenton, New Jersey. The settlers were mostly fur traders, though there was farming in the colony as well. In 1655 the territory was taken by the Dutch in a military expedition led by Director-General of New Netherlands Peter Stuyvesant, c. 1610–1672. For 9 years the territory was part of the Dutch colonial claims called New Netherlands. In 1664 the English claimed it and the rest of New Netherlands. Delaware was set up as a British proprietary colony, which it remained until the outbreak of the American Revolution, 1775–83. New Sweden was the only Swedish colony in the Americas.
Why is Beowulf considered an important work?
Beowulf, the earliest manuscript of which dates to about A. D. 1000, is the oldest surviving epic poem in English or any other European vernacular. It was written in Old English, the language of the Anglo-Saxons in England, used CAD 500–1100. Its author is unknown. Categorized as a folk epic, Beowulf tells the story of a Scandinavian warrior hero who, on behalf of the Danish king, fights and kills the fearsome monster Grendel. Then slays the monster's mother, and finally engages a fire-breathing dragon in mortal combat. Because of its combination of Christian and pagan themes, scholars believe the epic may have been written as early as 700 or 750.
Who were the apostles?
The apostles were 12 men chosen by Jesus Christ, c. 6b.cc AD 30, to be his close followers. The apostles helped spread the word that they believed Jesus to be the Son of God. Matthew 10:1 explains that Jesus gave the 12 authority to drive out unclean spirits and to cure every kind of illness. In Matthew 10:2-4, the names of the 12 apostles are given as Simon Peter, who is later simply called Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas. Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot. But the lists of apostles found in Luke 6:13-16 and in Acts 1:13 differ from that found in Matthew. While both Luke and Acts cite Simon, Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, they do not name Thaddeus, but rather Judas the son of James. In other words, the lists agree on 11 of the 12 names. After Judas Iscariot betrayed Jesus Christ, Matthias was chosen by the apostles to take his place. This is described in Acts 1:21-26. He was considered eligible since, like the 11 remaining apostles, he accompanied Jesus from the time of Jesus's baptism until the day he was taken up from us.
When was the Bible written?
The Old Testament, or Hebrew Bible, which is called the Book of Books because of its profound influence, was written thousands of years ago. Scholars disagree about exactly when or how the books were written. But it is generally accepted that the earliest parts of the Bible originated during the time of Moses, or Moshe. The Hebrew prophet and leader, about the 14th to the 13th century BC. Moses is believed to be the author of the first 5 books of the Bible, called the Pentateuch or the Law of Moses. The books include Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These are believed to have been revealed to Moses by God. Scholars believe that much of the material in the Bible was recited aloud as part of an oral tradition long before it was written down, which complicates the matter of assigning dates to the various books. The books of the prophets, Joshua, Isaiah, Samuel, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, etc., are believed to have been written and collected during the kingdoms of Israel, c. 1020 to 722 BC, and Judah, c. 933 to 586 BC, and shortly thereafter. Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, or Song of Songs, Ruth, Ecclesiastes, and Chronicles were written in the time of King David and King Solomon during the 10th century BC or shortly after 1000 BC. The books of Job, Lamentations, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah are believed to have appeared between 600 BC and 100 BC. The 27 books of the New Testament, upon which Christianity is based, were written on papyrus scrolls, none of which remain. Dating the writing of the New Testament is difficult, but the historical events referred to in the books indicate they were written shortly after the time of Christ and probably before AD 100.
What happened to the Philippines after they were ceded by Spain?
After the United States gained control of the Philippines in the Treaty of Paris, 1898, the Pacific archipelago was soon embroiled in a conflict similar to the one in Cuba, which had developed into the Spanish-American War. Filipinos, determined to achieve independence, revolted in an uprising that lasted from 1899 to 1901. A civil government was established on the Philippines in 1901, and in November 1935, the Commonwealth of the Philippines was officially established. However, the islands would continue to be the site of conflict in the coming decades, as the United States again struggled with a foreign power. This time the Japanese for control of the islands during World War II, 1939 to 45.
What were the hallmarks of the Cold War era?
At home, the hysteria of the Cold War era reached its height with the so-called McCarthyism of the 1950s. Historian Doris Kearns Goodwin described it as one of the most destructive chapters in American political history. In early 1950, Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy, 1908 to 1957, of Wisconsin claimed to possess a list of more than 200 known communists in the U.S. state department. The startling accusation launched congressional inquiries conducted by the Senators Subcommittee and the House Committee to investigate un-American activities. Suspicions of communist subversion ran high even in Hollywood, where a blacklist named those who were believed to have been involved in the Communist Party. McCarthy never produced his laundry list of offenders in the State Department, and the sorry chapter was closed when, on live television, the senator's bitter attacks went too far. In televised hearings in 1954, the senator took on the U.S. Army. Determined to ferret out what he believed was a conspiracy to cover up a known communist in the ranks. Faced with McCarthy's slanderous line of questioning, Army Counsel Joseph Welch, 1890 to 1960, delivered a reply that finally disarmed McCarthy, saying, "Have you no sense of decency, sir? If there is a God in heaven, your attacks will do neither you nor your cause any good." The retort was met with applause in the courtroom, heralding the end of the communist in our midst hysteria. But the Cold War deepened during the course of the 1950s. As distrust on both sides was increased by the shadow of possible nuclear destruction. Both the United States and the Soviet Union funneled vast resources into the development of weapons systems. As each side believed deterrence would determine the victor in the Cold War, it would be won by the nation able to create weapons so powerful that the other nation would be deterred from attacking. The military build-up became an all-out arms race. Competition between the Eastern Bloc and the West spilled over into athletics, the arts, and the sciences. In 1957, the Soviets beat the West into space with the launch of the first artificial satellite, Sputnik, which they followed in 1961 by completing the first successful manned space launch. The United States responded by stepping up its space program and vowing to put a man on the moon. Events in the early 1960s heightened tensions between the two sides, causing many to fear the war would turn hot. When an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over the Soviet Union and its pilot was captured in 1960, the United States was forced to admit to conducting a program of aerial reconnaissance. In 1961, the U.S.-backed invasion of Cuba, known as the Bay of Pigs, failed, revealing American involvement in the plot. Also that year, the Berlin Wall was built to stop the flow of emigrants out of East Germany, and becoming a visible symbol of the division between East and West. And in 1962, U.S. President John Kennedy, 1917 to 1963, and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, 1894 to 1971, squared off in the Cuban Missile Crisis. A full-scale conflict was averted through diplomacy. Later in the decade and into the 1970s, tensions relaxed and both sides began agreeing to limit the arms race, signing the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968 and the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I, in 1972, and agreeing to the Helsinki Accords in 1975, but East and West remained suspicious and watchful of each other into the 1980s. Most observers agree the Cold War did not come to an end until the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, c. 1990.
How old is the concept of public schools?
It dates at least as far back as ancient China. The philosopher Confucius, 551 to 479 BC, was among the first in China to advocate that primary school education should be available to all. He averred that in education there should be no class distinctions. He never refused a student, even though he came to me on foot, with nothing more to offer as tuition than a package of dried meat. Confucius asserted that any man, including a peasant boy, had the potential to be a man of principle. However, it was not until the Age of Enlightenment that public schools were widely instituted. In Prussia, present-day Germany, Frederick the Great, 1712 to 1786, was considered an enlightened ruler for, among other things, founding a public education system, which became established during the early 1800s. After Prussia united with Germany to form a powerful state, other European countries began instituting systems of public education which were credited by many as an important factor in Prussia's rise. By the early 20th century, public elementary schooling was both free and compulsory in most of Europe. Free secondary education was also offered in some nations. In the United States, public schools had their beginnings during colonial times. In 1647, Massachusetts passed a law requiring the establishment of public schools.
How old is the British Parliament?
The Legislative Assembly of Great Britain has roots dating back to the Middle Ages. 500-1350, when a great council, known as the Curia Regis, advised the king. This body was made up of nobility and clergy. The body evolved over time and progressively gained more power to govern. Today Parliament consists of the House of Commons, a democratically elected body, roughly equivalent to the U.S. House of Representatives, the House of Lords, which consists of noblemen, dukes, marquises, earls, viscounts, and barons, as well as high-ranking Anglican clergy, bishops and abbots, and the monarch, king or queen. Since 1911 the power of the House of Lords has been negligible, with the House of Commons charged with electing the Prime Minister, who must be a member of Commons. The Prime Minister, not the monarch, is the executive head of government.
Who was Tokyo Rose?
Wartime radio broadcasts by a woman called Tokyo Rose were an Axis propaganda. effort intended to weaken the resolve of American and Allied troops. The Japanese pressed into service Allied POWs and a woman named Eva Toguri d'Aquino, a U.S. citizen caught in wartime Japan, to read over the radio what were intended to be demoralizing messages to the Allied troops. Originating in Japan and heard by soldiers and sailors in the Pacific. The broadcasts were either disregarded by their intended audience or were found mildly amusing. Though d'Aquino was later convicted of treason. In 1977 President Gerald Ford issued an unconditional pardon in the case, which was built on tainted facts. The Axis powers did the same sort of broadcasts from Germany, where Axis Sally aired messages that were heard throughout Europe.
What is the Patriot Act?
The Patriot Act is a controversial law passed by a wide majority of Congress and signed by President George W. Bush, 1946, in October 2001. It was designed to strengthen national security following the 9/11 terrorist attacks. The legislation relaxes federal surveillance laws, granting authorities broad leeway to gather information on U.S. citizens and resident foreigners. It also expands the government's prosecutorial powers against suspected terrorists and their associates. The complex act, which contains 168 sections, allows the nation's intelligence and law enforcement agencies to, among other things, monitor email and financial transactions without securing a subpoena, use wiretapping without a court order, and require Internet service providers, ISPs, to hand over usage data on customers. One of the most controversial sections of the Patriot Act is the so-called library provision, which allows government officials to secretly subpoena books, records, papers, documents, and other items from businesses, hospitals, and other organizations. Critics feared that the government could use the provision to snoop into the reading habits of innocent Americans. The reaction to the provision was so strong that, according to the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, 5 states and 375 communities in 43 states had passed Anti-Patriot Act resolutions by spring 2005. Another contentious section of the Patriot Act allows the delayed notification of search warrants. This is called the sneak and peek provision because it lets federal officials search a suspect's home without telling the individual until later. While many legislators and security experts hailed the Patriot Act provisions as necessary in combating terrorism and securing the homeland, others immediately saw the legislation as a serious infringement of civil rights. Supporters pointed to the hundreds of charges brought against suspected terrorists, as well as hundreds of convictions, as a result of the Patriot Act. But critics, including legislators, the ACLU, conservative groups, and many citizens, called the act unconstitutional and unpatriotic. A top ACLU representative said, "Cooler heads can now see that the Patriot Act went too far. Too fast, and that it must be brought back in line with the Constitution." The fallout included charges of abuses by law enforcement, the introduction of alternate legislation in Congress to revise or repeal sections of the Act, as well as challenges in court. In 2004, at least 2 sections were found to be unconstitutional in district court. As the debate continued over the constitutionality of the Patriot Act, some provisions were set to expire the end of 2005. In April, 2 of the Bush administration's top law enforcement officials urged Congress to renew every provision of the Anti-Terror Act, Attorney General Alberto Gonzales, 1955, said that some of the most controversial provisions of the Patriot Act had proven invaluable in fighting terrorism. FBI Director Robert Mueller, 1944, said sections of the law that allow intelligence and law enforcement agencies to share information were especially important.
Why was Bunker Hill important in the American Revolution?
The June 1775 battle on the hills outside Boston proved to be the bloodiest battle of the war. After the fighting in April at Lexington and Concord, more British troops arrived in Boston in late May. The Americans fortified Breed's Hill, near Bunker Hill. And on June 17, the British were ordered to attack the Americans there. The Patriots, who needed to conserve ammunition, were given the famous direction not to fire until they saw the whites of their enemies' eyes. The Patriots succeeded in driving the British back on their first 2 charges. But on the 3rd charge, the Patriots fled. The Battle of Bunker Hill resulted in more than 1,000 injured or dead British soldiers and 400 American soldiers killed or wounded.
How was Rome sacked?
After the split of the Roman Empire in 395, the West Roman Empire continued to weaken, and Rome became subject to a series of brutal attacks by Germanic tribes. In 410 the Visigoths moved into Italy and looted Rome. In 455 the Vandals thoroughly ravaged the city. Finally, in 476 the city fell when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer, 433 to 493, forced Romulus Augustulus, c. 450-, the last ruler of the empire, from the throne. By this time, however, Germanic chiefs had already begun claiming Roman lands and dividing them into several smaller kingdoms. The year 476 marks the official collapse of the West Roman Empire.
Who invented the skyscraper?
The credit is usually given to American architect William Jenney, 1832 to 1907. who designed the 10-story home insurance building, erected on the corner of LaSalle and Monroe Streets in Chicago in 1885. The building was the first in which the entire structure was of skeleton construction of cast iron, wrought iron, and Bessemer steel. However, some experts believe the first skyscraper to have been designed was one by the American firm Halliburton and Roche, also in Chicago. The firm, founded by two former students of Jenny, designed the skeleton frame Tacoma building, which was actually not completed until 1889. Both the home insurance building and the Tacoma building were demolished in 1931 and 1929, respectively. It was the use of steel, the innovation of a safe elevator, and the use of central heating that combined to make possible the construction of tall buildings toward the end of the 19th century. Once the trend had started, it quickly took off. Another Chicago firm, Burnham and Root, Burnham, too, had been a student of Jenny, completed the 14-story Reliance building in 1895. It had a steel skeleton frame. The further development of the skyscraper is visible in the Gage buildings in Chicago, two of which were designed by Halliburton and Roche, and one by Lewis Henry Sullivan. 1856 to 1924, the Chicago architect often credited for mastering the skyscraper. Other Chicago skyscrapers built by Halliburton and Roche during the early days of modern architecture include the Marquette Building, 1894, and the Tribune Building, 1901.
Why was Julius Caesar murdered?
The Roman general and statesman Julius Caesar, 100 to 44 B.C., was stabbed to death in the Senate House by a group of men, including some of his former friends, who viewed him as an ambitious tyrant and a threat to the Roman Republic. The date of the assassination, March 15, fell into relatively common usage thanks to William Shakespeare's tragedy Julius Caesar, written in the late 1590s, which has a soothsayer warning the Roman general to beware the Ides of March. After Caesar's death in 44 BC, a triumvirate was formed to rule Rome, with Lepidus, Octavian, who would in 27 BC become Augustus, the Roman Empire's first ruler, and Mark Antony sharing power. It was Mark Antony, c. 83 to 30 BC, of Antony and Cleopatra of fame, who aroused the mobs against Caesar's conspirators, driving them out of Rome. The events illustrate the controversy about Julius Caesar. While some clearly viewed him as a demagogue who forced his way into power, others considered the patrician-born Caesar a man of noble character who defended the rights of the people in an oligarchic state where the government was controlled by a few people who had only their own interests in mind. This divided opinion has followed Caesar throughout history. While opinion is still divided on what kind of a ruler Caesar was, there can be no denying his contributions both to Rome, which would soon emerge as the Roman Empire, and to modern civilization. In his battles, Caesar brought the provinces of Italy under control and defeated his former co-ruler, Pompey the Great, who had, along with Caesar and Crassus, formed the first triumvirate, effectively ending the oligarchy that had ruled Rome. In so doing, he had succeeded in ending the disorder that had plagued Rome for decades and laid the groundwork for the formation of the empire under his grandnephew Augustus in 27 BC. While Caesar was in office, he planned and carried out several reforms, not the least of which was the implementation of the Julian calendar, which he introduced in 46 BC. The Gregorian calendar we use today evolved from it. Caesar also left a legacy of literature. He penned a total of 10 books on his battles in Gaul, c. 58 to 50 BC, and on the Civil War, which he had more or less started in 49 BC. These clear commentaries are still considered masterpieces of military history.
Was despotic Romanian leader Nicolae Ceausescu brought to justice?
In the 1989 trial of Nicolae Ceausescu, 1918 to 1989, and his wife Elena, 1919 to 1989, justice may not have been served. But many believed the tyrannical communist leader of Romania had indeed met with just deserts. The December 25 trial of the Ceausescus lasted all of 60 minutes. 55 minutes of questioning, to which the president's response was, "I do not recognize you, I do not recognize this court," followed by 5 minutes of deliberation. The court and judge were made up of the leaders in the popular rebellion that had begun December 16 when a pro-democracy rally attended by some 350,000 people ended in the Romanian armies and Ceausescu's secret police attacking unarmed demonstrators, killing several hundred men, women, and children. In demonstrations that followed, the Romanian army, long resentful of the privileged status enjoyed by the president's secret police, turned on Ceausescu's government, handing over automatic weapons to insurgents, whom they now joined in a popular uprising. On December 21, state television and radio came under the people's control, as did the Communist Party's central building and the Royal Palace, which were later found to be replete with luxuries and were also connected by a maze of tunnels. The Ceausescus and a few of their close associates tried to flee, but were captured on December 22, the same day that mass graves were found, revealing the secret police's torture and destruction of several hundred men, women, and children. The rebels drove the Ceausescus around for 3 days, averting the still loyal secret police. Realizing that time was not on their side, the captors assembled an extraordinary military tribunal in a small schoolroom at an army barracks. A defense lawyer was provided for Ceausescu. Counsel urged the former president to plead guilty by reason of insanity. He refused. The charges against Ceausescu included genocide, the massacre of demonstrators, and subversion of the economy for his own benefit. 1 hour later, the guilty verdict was delivered. Asked if they wished to appeal the decision, the Ceausescus remained silent. They were promptly taken outside, where a squad opened fire on the former president and his wife. Videotape of the brutal killings. The squad had fired as many as 30 rounds, was shown on Romanian television. By December 30 the country was controlled by rebel forces.
How long have sundials been in use?
Sundials, which indicate the time of day by the shadow cast by a stick, pin, or other object. Usually on a horizontal plate, have been in use since before the 6th century B.C., when both the ancient Chinese and Egyptians used the device to tell time. Sundials proved to be a fairly accurate indicator of the passage of time. But it has its problems. A sundial can be difficult to read. The markings have to be adjusted according to latitude, and the readings differ with the seasons. They remain popular as garden ornaments today.
When was insulin discovered?
Insulin, a hormone that regulates sugar levels in the body, was first discovered in 1889 by German physiologist Oskar Minkowski, 1858–1931, and German physician Joseph von Mering, 1849–1908. They observed that the removal of the pancreas caused diabetes in dogs. Researchers set about isolating the substance, but it was not until 1922 that insulin was used to treat diabetic patients. The first genetically engineered human insulin was produced by American scientists in 1978.
What were scalawags?
Scalawags was a derogatory term used by white Southerners to refer to those white Southerners who supported or were sympathetic to the goals of the Republican lawmakers during Reconstruction. 1865–77, the years of rebuilding that followed the American Civil War, 1861–65. The Republican Party was the object of much contempt in the American South during the mid to late 1860s. Congress was dominated by radical Republicans who were able to overturn presidential vetoes to achieve their goals. While President Andrew Johnson, 1808–1875, supported a lenient policy toward the Southern rebel states, Congress favored a more gradual approach to reunification. In order to prevent another resurgence in the South, Congress delayed the readmission of former Confederate states until Republican governments could be established in them. Congress was also determined to enact legislation and sponsor constitutional amendments that would extend the rights of citizenship to freed slaves. After 4 years of brutal combat during the war, many Southerners saw fit to side with the Union and with the Republican lawmakers who were determining Reconstruction policy. President Andrew Johnson had proved himself an ineffectual leader, and Congress had mustered enough votes to repeatedly override him. In fact, they impeached him in 1868. Some whites in the South, contemptuously called scalawags, joined with Northern businessmen and politicians, derisively called carpetbaggers, as well as the freed slaves to forge a new South.
How did Carl Sagan popularize science?
Carl Sagan, 1934 to 1996, a Cornell University astronomy and space science professor, became known to many Americans via his 13-part television program, Cosmos, which first aired on Public Broadcasting Service (PBS) affiliates in the fall of 1980. The show covered a variety of science topics, including the origin and evolution of life on Earth, the evolution of the human brain, black holes, time travel, space exploration, and the ultimate fate of the universe. The program did so well for a while, ranking as the highest-rated regular series in public television history, that it also spun off a book by the same name. Cosmos, the book, became a bestseller and is still in print.
What was Goethe's contribution to world literature?
Johann Wolfgang Goethe, 1749 to 1832, is considered Germany's greatest writer. He also was a scientist, artist, musician, and philosopher. As a writer, Goethe experimented with many genres and literary styles, and his works became a shaping force of the major German literary movements of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. His masterwork, the poetic drama Faust, 1808, rewritten 1832, embodies the author's humanistic ideal of a world literature, one that transcends the boundaries of nations and historical periods. Indeed, the story of Faust, a German astrologer, magician, and soothsayer, c. 1480 to 1540, remains one of universal interest, and has been treated often in both literature and music. The legendary figure was believed to have sold his soul to the devil in exchange for the opportunity to experience all of life's pleasures.
Who were the Vikings?
The Vikings, also called Norsemen, were fierce, seafaring warriors who originated in Scandinavia. Beginning in the late 700s, they raided England, France, Germany, Ireland, Scotland, Italy, Russia, and Spain. Great shipbuilders, the Vikings also reached Greenland, Iceland, and probably even North America long before the Europeans. Ruins of a Norse settlement were found on the northeastern coast of Newfoundland, Canada. The Vikings were converted to Christianity during the 10th and 11th centuries. About the same time that the kingdoms of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden were established. Under the Danish leader Canute, Vikings conquered England in 1016 and ruled it as part of Denmark until 1042.
What was Black Friday?
The term refers to one of two Fridays in the second half of the 1800s when severe market drops precipitated financial crises in the United States. The first Black Friday was September 24, 1869, financiers J. Gould, 1836–1892, and James Fisk, 1834–1872, had conspired to raise the market price of gold by buying it in huge quantities, leaving less supply on the open market, which would, theoretically, increase demand and therefore price. Having caused the price to increase, the businessmen planned to sell their gold supplies at a profit. While they did make out handsomely, clearing some $11 million, a panic resulted when the price of gold rose sharply. Businesses that needed gold to meet their obligations were forced to pay exorbitant prices for it. The government responded to the crisis by selling off $4 million of its gold reserves, causing gold prices to tumble. Speculators were hit hard, but Gould and Fisk came out unscathed, selling off their gold supplies before the price plummeted. 4 years later, another Friday turned dark when the investment banking firm of J. Cook and Company failed after it had invested too heavily in railroad securities, which had since declined. When news of the company's collapse was released on September 19, 1873, it affected the entire stock market, and prices fell sharply. The so-called Panic of 1873 signaled the beginning of a depression that persisted through most of the 1870s.
Why is the Cathedral of Notre Dame famous?
The Paris Cathedral was built using the first true flying buttresses, masonry bridges that transmit the thrust of a vault or a roof to an outer support. The device allowed the structure to achieve a great height, one of the first Gothic churches to do so. Gothic was a medieval architectural style that predominated in Northern Europe from the early 12th century until the 16th century. It was epitomized in elaborate churches with stained glass windows, ornamentation meant to instill the building itself with transcendental qualities. One of the leading examples of Gothic architecture is the Amiens Cathedral. In Amiens, northern France, which was begun in 1220. Its soaring nave, the central area of a church, epitomizes the era's drive for height. The Amiens Cathedral is France's largest.
What happened in the Oklahoma City bombing?
The attack took place at 9:02 a.m. on April 19, 1995, when a truck bomb exploded outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Of the 168 people who were killed, 19 were children. Another 500 people were injured. The blast, which investigators later learned had been caused by a bomb made of more than 2 tons of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil, sheared off the front half of the 9-story building and left a crater 8 feet deep and 30 feet wide. Nearby buildings were damaged or destroyed, including a YMCA daycare center where many children were seriously injured. The force of the explosion shattered windows blocks away. Survivors of the blast and others in the vicinity began rescue efforts right away. Eventually, more than 3,600 people from around the country participated in rescue operations, including police, firefighters, and members of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. Police and Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, agents arrested members of an American right-wing militant group who were suspected of wanting to avenge the April 19, 1993, FBI/ATF raid on the Branch Davidian religious compound in Waco, Texas. Former Army buddies Timothy J. McVeigh, then 27, and Terry L. Nichols, then 40, were indicted on August 10, 1995, on 11 charges each. The two were tried separately and convicted in federal court. McVeigh was found guilty of murder and conspiracy in June 1997, and a federal jury sentenced him to death. Nichols was later found guilty of conspiracy and involuntary manslaughter. But in January 1998 the jury deadlocked on the sentence, which was then to be decided by the judge. In early June it was decided that Nichols would serve life in prison. Officials believe the Murrah Federal Building was targeted in the anti-government attack because it housed 15 federal agencies, including offices of the Social Security Administration, SSA, Housing and Urban Development, HUD, the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF, as well as several Defense Department offices and a government-run daycare center.